here tonight. We have Marisol Garcia-Reyes to tell us about Upwelling, and I just thank her for being here, and I'll let you dive in. She's with the Farallones Institute. There are quite a few people who are connected to Noya Center through that. We're a great community, coastal community connected by our dear ocean. All right, without further blah-de-blue, I introduce to you, Marisol. Take it away.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you everybody at the Noya Center for the invitation, and thank you everybody for being here. I know it's late, and so it's great that you guys are interested about upwelling and marine heat waves enough to be here. I thank you, my coworkers that are here to curious about what I'm going to say. And it's great that you guys are so knowledgeable in coastal upwelling, so I don't have to spend too much time explaining that. And that's always those groups that have the best questions. So the way that that Sarah and talk about it, like we are going to leave questions towards the end. But if you guys like, there's something that you think that I should explain better, or because it's an important concept, for put it in the chat, and Sarah will let me know. I'm happy to stop and answer a question if that's going to benefit the talk. So let me share my screen and dive into this. I'm going to talk about marine heat waves and the relationship with coastal upwelling mainly along the Northern California coast, but actually I'm going to talk a little bit about the entire coast and other places. But as I say, I'm Marisol Garcia-Reyes. I'm actually an oceanographer, although I studied atmospheric science and physics, but I work at the Farallones Institute, and I do a lot of research on how the ocean conditions and climate impact the marine ecosystem. And I focus mostly in upwelling systems, although I apply to other things, but upwelling has me fascinated since the first time I studied. I really like the interaction between atmosphere, ocean, biology that upwelling brings. And now, well, the marine heat waves are the new topic, so that's what I study these days. I don't know how to advance this. Oh, there you go. So let's start with just the definitions of coastal upwelling. Coastal upwelling, as you guys know, it's driven by the winds, and mainly it is the winds. Can you guys see my cursor? I don't know if I have a pointer.
Yeah, we see it. We see
okay, perfect. That's so yeah. Coastal upwelling is driven by winds that blow along the coast in our region from the north, or the northwest, actually, because that's the orientation of the coast. And what they do is kind of push the water along with it, right? It drags the water. But because of the rotation of the earth, and actually because the earth is round as well, what is called the Coriolis effect, this water, instead of being pushed along the coast as well, they kind of turn a little bit. This surface current turn to the right and offshore a little bit. And that generates kind of a vacuum here at the coast, right? Like if the water is pushed offshore, something has to replace this water by the coast, and that is what is called the upwelling, the Ekman transport that bring deep water to the surface to replace this movement of offshore waters out offshore. And that's what we call coastal upwelling. There's other types of upwelling, but this is the coastal one. It requires a coast and winds that go along with it. But you all knew that. And the question is, why is this important and why do we care? And so the main thing is that when it brings water from the depth or from depth, this water is, to begin with, is cold because it hasn't seen the light of the sun for a little while, but it's also full of nutrients because they have not been spent for the same reason, that is lacking light. And also it's acidic, which I'm not going to talk about, but probably in other talks that you attend or other conversations, you'll see that this acidic water is very important for this area. But here I'm going to focus on that it's cold and it's very full of nutrients. And then this water comes to the surface. And when it reaches the surface, it also reaches an area that we call the Orthotic Zone, which is the area that is full of light. And that allows, like any other plant, to do photosynthesis, and that allows large phytoplankton blooms that can feed other things. It's pretty much grass growing in the ocean in a way. In our neighborhood, the winds, and this is a picture, or I don't know if it's a picture, but a still from a model of winds along the, I'm actually around the world, but I'm focusing on along the shore here. And you can see how strong the wind seems to be along the California current. I mean, they're going around what I'm going to talk about later, the North Pacific High, but you can see how along the coast, the winds go really straight along the coast and are really, really strong. And this is what causes upwelling along the California coast. And you can see here mostly from Mendocino, Point Conception here in Southern California to Cape Mendocino in the north. That is the core upwelling region of our California current system. And because the water that upwelling brings to the surface is from the depth, and I say it's cold, you can recognize upwelling by looking at the sea surface temperature and see that it's colder than the surrounding water. This is a satellite image from May 23, when there was a very strong upwelling event. And you can see here, just in the colors, I'm not going to talk right now about what the anomalies are. I will talk about that later. But really is the temperature above normal or around or in contrast or relative to the surroundings, what it's plotted here. And you can see that the water along the California coast is very cold in compared with the surroundings. And that's just a signature of upwelling. That means that water from below, it's been brought to the surface and it's very intense. And as a consequence of that, as I say, there's nutrients coming to the surface, and there is phytoplankton blooms, what we call, blooms, but I want to say the word in Spanish, and I don't know why I was going to say the afloramientos in Spanish. And this is a picture from 2004, so this is a little bit old. This is satellite data. But you can see how far these phytoplankton blooms, which is what is pictured here in red and green, reach offshore. And this obviously feeds a lot of animals and a lot of things, not just at the coast, but obviously very, very far away from the shore. And just as a cartoon here, these phytoplankton blooms, which in this cartoon appears at the bottom, they are gigantic, but that's why this system is so rich, because it can feed higher trophic levels, right? Like it feed the zooplankton, and those feed the fresh fish, and those feed the fisheries, the marine mammals, the seabirds, and not just the local community, but also a lot of migrating species that comes through these waters year round. And this is why coastal upwelling is really important. And there are 4 regions in the world that this happens in this large scale, I will say. This is one, the California current is one, but there's also in the other, what we call the eastern boundary current system or upwelling ecosystem. The other is in the Humboldt current here in Peru, or the Iberian Peninsula and Northwest Africa, and in the Benguela system in South Africa. And these regions, although in terms of area, they are very small, less than 1% of the ocean area, provide up to 20% of the world's fisheries and provide services to around 80 million people directly. Because of this, I don't know if it's endless, but very continuous supply of nutrients that feed all these fisheries and all these very rich and abundant marine life. And this is why they're so important, and this is why I'm very fascinated about them. So now, what are the marine heat waves? I'm just going to do definitions right now, and then we get into the relationships. Marine heat waves are not a new thing that is happening, but the definition and the way we study them are relatively new. So right now we are defining them as ocean climate extreme events, in which we have a region that have very, very warm water for a period of time. And this varies depending on the region. But what is important is that they can have consequences, and definitely negative consequences, to the marine ecosystem. In this picture on the left side, they are classified by how anomalous that warm water is, and just it's kind of around the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. But you can see in the bottom that in 1982, when there was an El Nino, we have some areas what we will now consider an extreme marine heat wave. At that point, we didn't call them that. We I mean, it was an El Nino event, and that's what we call them, just an event. And then in 2000, I mean, we have some of the first ones that are being more picked up because they're better localized here in Australia. And by 2016, which I'm sure all of you remember not so long ago, we have a very, very strong marine heat wave, not just around the North Pacific, but in many places around the world. They seem to be more frequent and intense. Now, there are still many ways to define them or to classify them, and this is one. This guy, Hobday, with a bunch of their collaborators, they're trying to figure out ways to classify them, kind of the same way that we do hurricanes right now. And what I'm going to show you some just different marine heat waves, but I just want you to show you how we classify them, how we actually measure them, because there are many sides to it. So on the right side here in this time series is time, and it's trying to show you two main things. First, this wiggly black line is the temperature at the surface that is measured in a particular area. In this case, the little square that is on the maps on the left. The black smooth line is what we call the climatology. That is what is the normal temperature at that day for that region. And then the following green lines that are on top is the deviation from the norm, right? Like the first one is one standard deviation, the second is 2 standard deviations. So the further up that we go is how anomalous above or how high above the normal this temperature is for a given day. So you can see that here for this part of northern Italy here, the temperature in June 2006, it was very normal, and then it started to get high. And then it was above the first threshold of normality, and this is why now it is yellow in color. It's a moderate marine heat wave for, you know, a few days here, and then it came back to normal. So this was one of the first events that we call extreme, that it was like, well, something's not normal here and it's lasting a little bit too long. So start cutting people's eye. Then we have this, well, we have many in between, but then we have a very extreme one in Western Australia in 2011. This is Australia here in the map, and this is the region of interest, and this is the region that is depicted here. So you can see that the seasonality or the normal is a little bit different, and the temperature wiggles a lot, but then it increased way too much, right? Like not just one standard deviation above the normal to give it like this yellow color, but actually it reached all the way to extreme, because there was like about 6 degrees of temperature increase between the normal and whatever temperature it was registered in March 2011. So this was very, very intense marine heat wave. And then we have our blob of 2014, 2016. And here you can see the time scale here in this graph on the right and the bottom. It's very different. This is not just few months like above. This is actually 2 years, from May 2014 all the way to August 2016. And that's why we have these ups and downs, right? It's a seasonal cycle of the temperature. So and also we have a very big area now on the left. It's not just one country, but 2 countries, and pretty much all the West Coast, except the very tip at the bottom. And you can see here the same thing, right? Like the temperature raised in August 2014, and it was not just moderate, but a strong marine heat wave, but it didn't go away, right? And it even increased again in the winter of 2015 and stay up, then increase again, and they stay up. This was a very, very long marine heat wave. So there's many different angles that we can see here, how intense it is in terms of temperature, how long it lasted, and how big the area that it was present. So there are many, many ways to look at it. And right now there is no one way to classify them or to compare them against each other. However, this North Pacific blob of 2015 one was one of the biggest and most extreme ones that we have ever experienced. And just to dwell a little bit on it, this is the blob, in case you didn't know it. This is the same figure here on the bottom on the right. You have to forgive me. I have dyslexia, and so sometimes I'm gonna mess up the right and left. But on the left side is this very striking, beautiful, and terrifying picture on the left is a satellite image of May 2015, which will be somewhere around here. It's not even the most intense moment of the marine heat wave that we know as the blob, but it's a very nice picture and it depicts exactly what we call it a blob. The colors exemplify the anomaly, which is how cold or warm it was with reference to the normal, right? This difference between the wiggling line and the black smooth line. And so you can see how hot it was here in the Northeast Pacific, right? It's a very big area and it's really, really hot, up to 3 degrees Celsius or around 6 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's really, really, really intense and very big area that we call the blob. And just, to put it in perspective, let me go back one slide, because something that I want to point out, because we're going to talk about this for the next few minutes, is what happened in the California coast. So in the southern area, in the southern part of the state, is still very warm, but in the northern part of the state and Oregon, it is actually not that anomalous, right? Like this gray color is actually no deviation from the norm. So really in this area, when we tend to have coastal upwelling, really we were not that aware that it was a marine heat wave if you didn't read the news or you didn't have these images. But let's look at Southern California when we did feel it. So this is a time series of sea surface temperature, more or less in La Jolla in Southern California. And of course, I'm doing this a little bit exaggerating the anomalous periods with the coloring. But what I want to show you here is that we did have in the past periods when the water was warmer than normal, right? And these were usually associated with El Nino events, right? We have the El Nino of 82, 83, the very strong 97, 98 El Nino. And these were now, if they happen right now, we'll be classifying them as marine heat waves. But at that point, we didn't call them that. Then we have a little bit of a cold period when there was not that many big events. But then the blob happened. And then the blob was followed by a very strong El Nino in 2016. So we have this very long period of very warm waters that were really, really warm, right? As you can see, the intensity of the marine heat wave. And then it kind of went back to normal. However, we keep having marine heat waves now. And again, this is Southern California. Upwelling doesn't play such a big role there. And so they are accentuated in this case, but this is for dramatic effects. But you can see how things are changing in the last few years. We are more immersed in these marine heat wave periods, and that's why we keep hearing about them a lot. And that's why I'm investigating them as well. But the question is, how are they generated? And the question that everybody asks in the news is, are they related to climate change? And I think that maybe in 2006, 2011, we were thinking, well, they could be. They definitely in agreement or we think it will happen with climate change. But by this time, we have so many and there's enough data to know that that almost for sure we can say that they are caused by climate change. But it is hard to pinpoint each of them to climate change per se, right? We scientists, we really like to be 100% sure, and we can never be 100% sure. But more importantly, we want to know how they generate, because that will give us a little bit more of a clue. So the answer is obviously it depends, but I'm going to talk about the blob in particular because that's the most, well, I don't know if dear to our hearts, but mostly like close to home. So I'm going to go back a little bit to this figure that is just the winds around what we call the North Pacific High. It's a high pressure system that is sitting offshore Northern California in the summer, and the winds go clockwise around it. And this happens mostly every spring and summer. So this is the model on the left, and you can see the winds that I showed you before. But on the right, it's just data from satellites that is averaged for many years for the summer, just to show you one, the color, this is the pressure, higher in the center and lower in the outer circles. And the little arrows that I hope you can see mark the direction of the winds. And you can see they go in clockwise and very strong along the coast. This is what is normal in our summers. And let me just explain very briefly with this cartoon how this atmospheric circulation works. Many of you probably know it from watching the Weather Channel, but I'm gonna need this cartoon, so I'm gonna explain it here. In the tropical areas, when there's a lot of heat around the equator, we have a lot of heat coming from the sun, and land and ocean start warming up, and that warms up the air around it. And so the air is starting to rise just because it's less dense. And this is what we call a thermal low pressure system, atmospheric pressure system, but it is a thermal low. And as this air from the ocean in particular start rising up, it start losing its water content, and that's why there's a lot of rain and a lot of storms in that area. But as it rises up, it cools down and lose all this moisture, and it's starting to feel a little bit heavy. But also it has to go somewhere, right? It cannot rise forever because it will escape into space, and that will not work. So it starts moving towards higher latitudes, for our case towards the north, and it started moving towards the north until it is too cold and it's heavy again, and it starts to condense, so it needs to go down just by gravity. And this is how the high pressure systems in the lands gets formed, because they're subsidence or air going down, air that is cold and dry because it already lost all this moisture, and it kind of keeps pushing towards the earth, and that's why we call it a high pressure system. Of course, it cannot push forever into the land, and once it reaches the surface, it has to go somewhere, so it tends to go offshore, or not offshore, sorry, away from the high pressure system. And this generates a circulation in the atmosphere. Of course, this is a cartoon, and I'm just gonna show you a more complicated picture, which I'm not gonna go into detail, but this is called in Earth, a Hadley cell, because Hadley was the one that first described it. So at the equator, air rises up because of the thermal increase in temperature, sorry, and then it moves towards the poles, and more or less around 30 degrees north or south, it starts losing steam and goes down. And this is why we have high pressure systems around these latitudes, which are called the mid latitudes. In the left is the whole Earth. You can see the Hadley cells, which is more or less at the tropics. But again, because the Earth is round and is rotating, this generates that the winds don't go just away from the high and towards the low. They go around a little bit, and you can see here already marking a circulation. But I'm gonna go back to this one and show this circulation is around the high because of this rotating Earth. But something else that I want to show you here is how these winds vary around this high pressure system, right? I mean, we already talked about the longshore winds, but that's because land is here. But around the high pressure system in the center, usually we do not have a lot of wind. Usually it's very dead wind. And that's why in meteorological terms, we call the high pressure system good weather systems, because there's not a cloud in the sky, there's sunny sky, and there's no wind. And unfortunately for the sailors back in the day, these were called the horse latitudes, because when you stuck in this center of the high pressure system, there was no wind to move you. And the sailors from Europe had to throw their dead horses off board. And that's why they're called the horse latitudes. I know, horrible, but that happens. And then around the high pressure system, we have the trade winds coming from the east to the west, which is what brought the sailors from Europe to America. And then the westerlies, right? That comes from, obviously, from the west, that in the North Atlantic will take them the other way. So these are how usually is the circulation around the high pressure system. Hopefully I didn't lose you here much. But the important point around here is that, I mean, since the westerlies keep going this way, and they cannot go into the center of the high pressure system because high pressure system, you can think about it also like a little bit of a mountain as well, that the winds will not climb. It just, they go around, right? And that's why we have the westerlies. So not just the winds go this way, but also any storm that could come from the Pacific will be deviated towards the north in this case and reach, well, Canada in this way, right? According to Mararos. But that's why we do not have rain in the summer in California, right? Because this high pressure system is blocking any storm to come into the continent. But in the winter, this high pressure system weakens and goes further south, and it's not as strong, so it doesn't really block the storms, and then they can reach Southern California. This is kind of a parenthesis, but I promise I'm going to use it in what I'm talking about marine heat waves. So this situation happens during the season. In the summer, the high pressure system goes up, blocks all these storms, and give us what we call our Mediterranean climate. And then in the winters goes away, and we can have rain whenever we can have rain. And especially during El Nino years, the North Pacific high goes further down and we have even more rain. But this is just on average, right? Like I'm averaging all the summers or averaging all the winters that we have data. But on the day-to-day basis, this doesn't work exactly that way. There are times that this high pressure system, it's a little bit nutty or a little bit crazy and got further up. It's not park, let me see, I think I have, no, sorry. It doesn't park exactly off Northern California, but go a little bit further. And in the case of the blob year, it not only parked a little bit further up, but it parked there for a very, very long time. And so it deviates the storm tracks a little bit further north, but also the wind, the area of no wind, it goes further up. Sorry, there's a lot of people outside. And this is incidentally how we got a very big drought on those years as well, because the very strong, what we call it the ridge, this very strong high pressure system, it went further north and it stayed there for a very long time, blocking all the storms, and they didn't reach all the West Coast. And this is why we have a very, very bad drought from 2012 to 2016 in California. I mean, this is just the area of drought during the years of the area of the state. So this is incidentally, but I promise I'm gonna go back to what we're talking about, because this storm track, I mean, this ridge that deviated the storm tracks also made the winds to move. The horse latitude, instead of being here, which they usually are, they moved further up, right, into this area where the blob formed. What happened is that once we didn't have winds in that area, these winds that usually cool the ocean, they didn't cool it. So the ocean started warming up, warming up, and warming up. And because this high pressure system didn't move, they really didn't go anywhere. That's why it was called the ridiculous resilient ridge. It keeps warming up and kind of created a feedback that just keep this water very, very warm for a very long time. And that's how this particular marine heat wave was generated. So, but now that was in the middle of the Pacific, right? So how this interacted with coastal upwelling. And I'm gonna show you a little bit of a movie if I still have people listening. Let me share my screen. Another, just to show you how this marine heat wave was generated to begin with. Can everybody see now the little video? I'm going to play it. So this is sea surface temperature anomalies along the Pacific, the Northeast Pacific, and starting in 2013. You can see first we have very cool waters, everything was pretty. And then the blob started to sneak in. Warm water starting to come in, which is kind of normal. But then it just started to be there the moment that the winds start failing. Right? So you can see now, you can see this reddish area that started to happen around here, and it's not going to go away. Right? A lot of variability is normal, but it starts to get a little bit more consistent at some point during the year. And you can see how it moves towards the coast and then it goes back, which is not technically the blob. The blob starts right here. I don't have the winds here, but you can see how it's starting to get really, really, really intense and big. But another thing that I want you to look at here is that at the coast, in the West Coast, the water is still really warm. Really cold. It's still really blue. And so this marine heat wave not only has not reached the coast yet, but also we were not having it. We were actually in the opposite side. We were having cold waters because there was a lot of wind related to this very strong high pressure system. And then I'm gonna just show you another one that is now for 2014, so the following year. Let me start from the beginning. So this is where we left. The blob started to form and be very, very strong there. And this is January. The date is at the top in case you didn't see it. But I want you to pay attention to two things. The blob is there and it obviously draws our attention, but I want you to look at the coast. The coast is not always very warm, although it's gonna get warm, but there are periods that you can see a little bit of blue, right? It comes and goes. And that is because coastal upwelling is happening there. So there's water that is brought from the bottom, and it's kind of giving a little bit of a break from the marine heat wave that keeps just hitting now the West Coast, right? Like now it moves from the center of the North Pacific into the West Coast. But by the end of the 2014 year, there is no more break anymore. Like it's all warm in here. So really the question is how these things interact and what is the consequences for us that we live at the coast, but also there's a lot of organisms that live mostly at the coast. And so for that, first we need a way to measure this. And there's a very simple but very useful metric that helps with this. This is again, you can see this is California, here's the Bay Area. The map is a little bit faint, but you can kind of see the contours there. And the colors that you see there is the temperature of the water at the surface. So here for this particular date, this blue water at the coast is because of coastal upwelling. And the warm water offshore is just because the water is warmer offshore because no upwelling has not reached that far away. So if we measure how much of this area, let's say this particular piece of ocean, how much of this area is cold and is showing us upwelling, then we can say how much this area is influenced by upwelling. If this area is smaller, right, very near to the coast or non-existent, that means that the water offshore, even if it's warm because of a marine heat wave or not, it's dominating the conditions in the coast. If this cold area is bigger, let's say it reaches farther away, that means that upwelling is having more of an influence offshore. And so this is what the index of Jarrod Santora did. And I'm just going to show you different pictures to kind of interpret this wind. This is the same, I mean, this index. This is exactly the same area. Here in color is that area that I showed you before. And what we're doing here is just measuring how much is below a certain threshold of quote, quote, normal temperatures for this area and for this time of year. So whatever you see within this black line means that it's an upwelling dominated area, right? Like in February, it tends to be very cold among this area. It's not that it's necessarily upwelling this time, but it's winter, so the water is relatively cold. March is more or less the same, but then March and April is starting to be very localized because it's related to coastal upwelling, right? This is the area that is dominated by coastal upwelling. May should be usually bigger, but in this particular year it's not super big because 2020 was not kind of a normal year, but it started to increase. So this is still upwelling, but by the end of the summer, the offshore waters that are warmer started to dominate and kind of pushing inside, and this area is starting to decrease a little bit. So this is kind of the normal seasonal cycle of this situation. Upwelling dominates during the spring and summer or early summer. But more interesting is what happened year to year, because this is how things are changing. See, this is from May 2013 to May 2021. And you can see May 2013 was kind of cold. There was this big area of upwelling dominated area. But in 14, although we still don't have very strong marine heat wave offshore, this area of upwelling dominance is definitely smaller, right? It's kind of pushed a little bit more towards the coast, and there's warmer waters offshore. In 2015, curiously, we actually have a little bit of a bigger area and not so much warm outside, but this is because of upwelling existing. 2016, the area is smaller, but not too much. It was not that horrible. But then it started to recover. In 2017, it grew again. 18, more or less okay. But 19, which is this bottom here, it actually is reduced very much. And that was because there was another marine heat wave reaching the coast here. And 2020 was really warm out offshore too. So the area that it was dominated by the upwelling was really small. But then 2021, actually has been a year with record upwelling. It's been very strong. And so this May, all this region was completely dominated by upwelling. It was really, upwelling was so intense that this cold water kind of pushed any warm water away from the coast. So this was May, when it's the core of upwelling. But then if I look at August, when upwelling is decreasing, as you know, by then the winds are not that intense. Again, we have 2013 and this time only to 2020. We see that in the years of the blob, 2014 and 15, this area is reduced drastically because the waters offshore, the very hot waters offshore that were related to the blob, really push into the coast, pushing the cold water from upwelling really into a tiny band. It recovered a little bit by August 2016 and maybe 17 even better. But as you can see, 19 was still very hot, although with a lot of upwelling. We'll see what 2021 it is like, because it was very strong upwelling, but we don't know how things are going to be out there. So coming back to this figure, really this line moves a lot. So really the conditions at the coast is kind of a tug of war between coastal upwelling, how strong it is, and how much the marine heat waves are pushing, right? It's kind of a go back and forth in how much upwelling habitat we have, which is how we call it. And why this is important is because this upwelling habitat, it tends to be the suitable habitat for the animals that live here, well, and plants obviously. And so that's what is this portion of the coast that is suitable is very important. And when this band of suitable habitat is very narrow, what we think happens is that all the animals kind of push together to get the good conditions, right? Everybody wants to be where the food is. And if it expands, Upwelling it's very strong and it dominates the entire region, then all the animals have kind of more space to spread out, and there's food for everybody. And again, there's a marine heat wave or a very warm year, and this area gets contracted. And so all of them are on top of each other, or whoever is around. And that's where, for example, there's a lot of whale entanglements, because the whales are trying to feed in the same grounds are the fishermen and try to get Dungeness crab, for example, because all the food is right there in the same small area that is suitable for habitat. And so I think that my conclusion it is more or less that coastal upwelling is keeping our marine heat waves at bay, and some years are going to win, some years are not going to win, but that's one more thing that coastal upwelling it's doing good for us, keeping our coast a little bit cooler than it is for the rest of the ocean. And with that, I will take any questions.
That was phenomenal. I just love getting that a whole semester of oceanography so beautifully presented and concise, and it took a lot to wrap my brain around that in my teacher, with my professor, a whole semester of kind of really trying to understand that, and you really explained it beautifully. So thank you, and I hope we'll have questions. And, if you do have a question, I think we're a small enough group where you can, if you'd like to, kind of carefully unmute yourself. If you have a question, I'll call on you. How about, and then you can unmute and ask your question yourself if you like.
Hi, Sarah.
Yeah.
Is it time for a question?
Yes, please.
Could you? That was beautiful, Marisol. Thank you. Can you explain how upwelling is created? I have pictures of it in my mind, but it's not very clear yet.
Yeah, I went really fast on that because I figure you guys are a very educated bunch. But I'm just gonna share the first picture, and for me the Zoom doesn't do justice because I like to do a lot of hand movement.
So, well, we can see you, so you can do that.
So I will do it, but I'm gonna go back to the very first slide that I put when I talk about upwelling. So these winds that are the longshore winds that create upwelling. This is what you're asking me, right? About how these winds are created, or
yes.
So these winds actually, I mean, they're fascinating. I didn't want to go into detail about that, but wait, that's not what I wanted to do. Sorry. But they're really related to the North Pacific High. I love this picture because it's just winds shown by a model, but you actually, I mean, there's winds are so strong around the North Pacific High that you do not need the atmospheric picture of that, right? The North Pacific High, which is actually here, you can see the winds going around it. And that atmospheric feature, this ocean high pressure system that is kind of pushing the air away, and it's rotating because of the air rotation that generates these winds around it. In the northern hemisphere, there's a high pressure system, there's always this clockwise winds around it. But this high pressure system is so close to the land and it's so big and strong that whenever these winds reach land, they encounter, well, first land, but then the coastal ranges, and they kind of get funneled along the coast. And that's why they're so strong and so very well directed along shore. And that's why we have upwelling that is so intense. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
I have a question.
Yes.
What was the, you mentioned the acidic, what's the significance of the acid or whatever?
There are two, and they're good, but I mean, there's a lot of talk about ocean acidification these days, and there's a lot of concern in upwelling areas because the water in the depths of the ocean is more acidic. So whenever upwelling brings this water to the surface, the organisms that are at the coast, they experience acidic conditions all the time. So if they become more acidic, they have more acidity than any other organism around the world. On one side, these organisms are already kind of accustomed to these ups and downs of acidification. So in a way, they are adapted to it. But the more we put CO2 in the ocean, these are going to get levels of acidity that can be very, very high for very long periods of time. And particularly shells are the ones that are being most affected. And in some areas, I mean, we have some shells, obviously, we like to get our oysters, but there are other upwelling systems like Spain, for example, that they are famous for their shelf harvest and their shelf growth. So they are being very affected, or could be very affected by these more acidic waters coming with upwelling.
Also, I couldn't tell how far offshore was the extreme heat in the blob. I mean,
well, the center of the blob was kind of in the middle of Alaska, okay, right? But at some point, I mean, that's where it started. But as things progressed in 2015, it reached the coast, and it could get few hundred kilometers offshore. So that was pretty big area that it was warm. However, in May, when it was the upwelling, the kind of the peak of the upwelling season for us, 2014, 2015, and 16, even if it was hot and terrible offshore, within the band of the coast, we have very normal temperatures because of upwelling. So there were, normally it is about 30 to 50 nautical miles offshore that we can see this upwelling signature, and it was reduced to probably half of it because of the marine heat wave. But still, if you're at the coast, you had warm, cool water.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I feel like that was when we saw probably more whales right off of Fort Bragg than I've ever seen before. It was like, you know, as far as you could see south to as far as you could see north, whales everywhere. And it was in the, you know, the weird, I think it was in maybe 2015 or 16. And that kind of condensation of the cool upwelling water, yes, like you were explaining, everything was right there where, you know, where we could all see it.
Everybody wanted the cool water.
Yeah, yeah. Very, very cool.
I have a question. I've had my hand up for a while, but I guess we're just going to speak up.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I will do better.
No problem. Just a couple, well, first one, just a quick story. I had an exchange student from Brazil on the equator. She lived in Fortaleza, way up high, and brought her to the ocean. I was so excited to show her the ocean on our side. And she said, "Oh, it stinks." And I said, no, that's life. Your area has no life. We have life because of the upwelling and the you know, that's the stink. But anyway, it was to see it from her eyes, it was her area is more like a lake in the ocean, which brings up one of my questions. Why do you know why the whales calve in areas that have no feeding, like Hawaii and places like that?
Offhand, no, but it's true that that there are certain animals that go to this area that are not as rich as ours, right? And I think that it has more to do with the lack of predators and better physiological conditions. right? Like the conditions are not as harsh in terms of temperature than here. And that's why, for example, they go to southern Baja California to give birth, because they don't have to spend so much energy there. There's not as much predators because there's not a lot of food. So I think that's more like a survival mechanism than anything else. And that's why they go back to Alaska, right? When there's a lot of food to fed up through the summer there. So I'm guessing it's the same thing in Brazil, that these animals go there because it's safe.
Yes, right. So I have a follow-up question, which is, have you seen any, or have you heard about any correlation between fish populations and these, you know, because so many people are dependent on them economically, fish populations and the blobs?
Yes, I mean, for the blob, it's a little bit hard to say because at the coast, when there's a lot of fisheries, we have also a very bad, harmful bloom, right? So that also affected all the fisheries. So it's kind of confounded. But for example, there was a terrible die-off of birds, of moors, of Alaska, which it's due to the lack of fish. And fishers start to see at the end of 2016, I think, decreases in the number of fish that they can see. So I don't have the statistics, but I think in Alaska, it was more obvious in the fisheries directly because of the blob. And California is a little bit more confounded because of the algae bloom that we have that lasted pretty much the entire marine heat wave.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I have a question here in the chat from Tara that she says, my understanding is that with climate change, winds are predicted to increase along our coast. Is that correct? And will this increase the upwelling?
Yes, that's a very good question. Thank you. That's something that I like to study, and thank you for asking, because I love that question. Yes, we're seeing in many of the upwelling systems increasing winds, and there has been different theories or current hypothesis that we're proposing is that yes, they're going to increase, but mostly in the more polar areas, and this is because this North Pacific high or any other high pressure system in the mid latitudes, it's going to start migrating towards the poles because of climate change, and this will make the winds that obviously go around the North Pacific high a little bit stronger in northern parts of the upwelling areas. And we currently are observing more intense winds through the year. I mean, this year it's going to be a record year in terms of upwelling, but we've been seeing a little bit of increase through the years, particularly in Northern California. So yeah, that is correct. Seems that it's consistent with our hypothesis, and other systems have seen the same.
Let's see if we have that. Yeah, great question. Thank you. That's awesome that you can answer that. And yeah, I keep feeling like celebrating this little bit of upwelling and seeing, you know, maybe I'm looking in the wrong places, but seeing perhaps a little bit more kelp than we've seen the kelp growth. I'm ever the optimist and hopeful that, you know, we're seeing just a little bit of cold water for the kelp, and that it might just be a little bit happier, making all of us a lot happier.
Yeah, no, it's true. And one thing, I mean, we're seeing a little bit of increase in the winds, but definitely one of the consequences of that will be more water coming up, which you will think that's cooler water, but actually because of global warming, it kind of competes, increasing global temperatures, but also more upwelling. So really along the coast, we're not seeing a trend in increasing or decreasing temperatures in the long term. And this is because of upwelling. So I think that if it was not because of this well, constant upwelling, but also increasing, we will be seeing many more consequences of warm waters. And so I think I'm appreciative of it, and I think we should be.
Have you, do you believe that more whales are getting lost because of the warmer waters?
I don't know if it's the warmer waters though. I really don't know why, but it seems like maybe the traffic that we generate is more damaging to them. But you know, many things are changing in our world right now, and I don't think we understand everything, right? Like there's so many things that we don't know, and maybe it's something that we don't know yet that they are affected by it. But you're right, like there's a lot of it, and one thing is for sure is that animals, they go wherever the food is and wherever they find good conditions. So I think it might have to do with that.
Yeah, and I'm curious what you mean by lost whales. Are you talking about the whales that are going into the San Francisco Bay, or perhaps speaking to the gray whales that are more prevalent along the coast here within the kelp forests, or kind of the year-round feeding group that we're seeing a little bit more of? Is that what you mean by lost whales?
Well, my question is because I see in the news a lot of, you know, San Francisco Bay is one, but it seems like we keep seeing, you know, whales popping up in places that we didn't expect them. And I don't know if they're sick or they're just lost or they're, you know, they're attracted to the upwelling or what, you know, I don't know if anyone knows, but I just wondered if Marisol had a theory.
Well, I mean, as Sarah said, in our system, whenever there's very warm conditions offshore, like as I say, this area compresses, and animals will follow the food, right? So that's why we see a lot of more whales near the coast, because they are looking for this area of warm, I mean, cool water that is more nutritious and probably has more food. And I mean, it's not like they are lost necessarily, although if they get stranded, we might think that they are lost, but they are trying to find food as any other living animal. So I mean, not that this is exactly the same mechanism, but I guess in other places, they are trying to do the same. Maybe the conditions where they used to be, they're not as good. So they are just trying to find a way.
Yeah,
that's plausible.
They're also, I mean, they're like the charismatic megafauna that kind of tell the story in a way, or at least get the attention of us going, why were there 17 whales that stranded in the Bay Area this summer? I mean, that washed ashore, period. You know, what is going on? And if you think about ship traffic and the increased demand on products and all of that, and it's just kind of coming together. I mean, it's been unprecedented, the amount of whales that came in, blew in a lot in the Bay Area, kind of crazy. But yeah, that gray whales have adapted through time, and they're one of the most adaptive types of creatures. They figure out different feeding strategies that adapt to different, you know, different conditions and whatnot. So yeah, I think that the mysteries, we're all seeing things that we've never seen before, and nothing is normal anymore. So be open to it and know that there are a lot of mysteries. Thankfully, we have people like Marisol studying the bigger things that we might not see, that take this talk to explain more of the picture. I have Bob Spees was wondering if the presentation is available somewhere. Love to access some of the graphics. The graphics were definitely great, especially like the high and low pressure systems and their interactions. And we did record this talk, but then maybe you can watch it and freeze it. But Marisol, maybe you have a better answer.
Well, at the beginning of the presentation is my email. And I'm just sharing mine with Robert, that if you email me, I'm happy to share it. I need to do a little bit more because right now it's gigantic. I don't know what image that I put there is gigantic, but I'm happy to share it once I put it in a more manageable size.
I have one more question. As you continue your by the way, it's a great presentation. I really enjoyed it. As you continue your research and collect more data, is there something that you hope to find or resolve, or how can this information be put to use where we can use it to correct a problem or fix something, or you know what I'm saying? Like,
that is a great question, because sometimes I wonder the same thing, like how understanding how crazy this is going, it's going to help anything. But I mean, I'll talk about one very specific example. There are many like this, but for example, I was talking to Sarah about kelp. One thing that I'm very interested in is bull kelp, right? Like we are all, I don't know, shocked and sad and a little bit desperate on seeing the situation of bull kelp. And I'm trying to understand how oceanographic conditions and all the things that we are understanding now are affecting the kelp. And one of the questions is like, well, it's already gone, so why you care? But I'm like, no, it's not going to be gone forever. There's a lot of effort, right, of doing, and it might start to come back, and it will be great to know if we can predict in advance that it's going to be a bad situation, to be able to do something about it. For example, save some spores, right, to be able to reseed next time if there's a patch that we need to protect, because it will help reseed the rest. So I think the more information we get, we can find ways to use it, right? And it's not always obvious. And I tell this to my brother, and because he always tells me the same thing, like, so how are you applying this? I'm like, well, I am a scientist. I'm not an engineer. Scientists, we generate information. It's up for the engineers to apply it. Some people are very good at both, but it definitely helps to understand, and so we can find ways forward, right? We always find the way forward. So,
well, there's a little bit of kelp along the coast. And it is increasing as the season goes on. So it's little premature for the wake, but yeah, it's in trouble.
It is, right? And we expected that it's not going to come back the way things are, and it's coming back. So there's hope.
Yeah.
I'll take that without a doubt. I mean, the hope that's going to fuel us to do more, to think about what we can do, you know. And sometimes it feels overwhelming, but understanding it gives us that little bit more of a way to move forward. And I love the way that you spoke to upwelling and all of the graphics. It makes me think of my oceanography teacher, Greg Grantham, who sadly passed away this year, or in 2020. But it was, this stuff, it just is mind-boggling, and it all connects back to seeing that whale, or seeing that seal, or the seabirds, or seeing, an albatross or something like that. It's all connected, and here's the graphics that are showing how those animals actually survive. So beautifully done. And one way that I tell the kids about it, because it takes those graphics or hand motions or whatever, but I say sometimes, do you have a compost pile? And you turn that compost pile and you bring that nutrients up to the surface for the sun to come down, and kind of in a way to connect it to a land thing that we might be familiar with, is that bringing that compost and turning the soil, bringing the nutrients up.
That's a very good analogy. I have never thought about it.
It sort of doesn't work as well as the actual.
I'm a city person, so usually no, but it's very good.
Thank you. Well, I hope you'll come and visit us as soon as you possibly can. Walk on the beach and look at the bull kelp that is
I
here.
definitely want to go and see those resilient bull kelp.
Yeah, it's pretty beautiful. We've got the Mendocino Bay is full of it, off of Portuguese Beach. It's very robust and beautiful, but again, it's kind of a special situation because of Big River and the sandy bottom, and something about the Mendocino Bay that makes us feel really hopeful. But there's a lot of bull kelp in there, and a lot of creatures feeding on it right now. So.
Yes, I bet. Everybody wants a piece of it, yes.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. Well, any other questions before we let you go and just huge gratitude to you. Gracias for your time. And
no, thank you for listening, and thank you for all the very good questions. I love when there's like, oh, that's a very good question, for paying attention.
yeah.
Well,
yes. Oh, I see a hand raised from Kristen. Or is that a hand?
It's not a hand raise.
It's a clap. It's a clap. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so very much, and we'll see you all next time.
Yeah. Goodbye, everybody. Have a nice summer.
You too.